So today we're going to be looking at what is actually involved parts-wise with swapping a late US spec MGB over from a single Stromberg carburetor to a pair of twin SU carburetors. So this isn't going to be an absolute 100% complete exhaustive list of every little detail of everything you need to do this. More of a basic list, because the exact components down to the smallest detail is going to depend on a number of factors, from the starting point, the car you're working with now, what's there, what isn't, and the ending point. What do you personally want from your car, both in performance, maybe exhaust sound quality, and visual appearance under the bonnet. So believe it or not, probably the most economical way of actually doing this conversion is to go find yourself a complete and intact chrome bumper parts car to do it with. Now I know this one has chrome bumpers on it, but this is actually a 75 that's had a chrome bumper conversion done to it. So this is a rubber bumper car from the factory. Now some of you might be going, huh? A whole parts car can make it cheaper than buying? Yes, absolutely it can. Because not only if you drag home a whole parts car and you have the space to do it and everything, you have a good reference to everything that's on the car, everything where it fits, how it goes together. You can take pictures. If you forget how anything goes back together, you have a reference to it. So that can make the conversion a little easier on you if you're not quite as familiar with these things. But also the difference from what you can sell the parts car for after you've taken all the parts that you need from it, from what you bought it for, can be less, and it can very likely be quite a bit less than what you'll pay for all those parts at swap meets, online, or otherwise off of a car already. Plus, that car might actually end up having other parts that you, one of your friends, or a fellow club member needs as well. And if you're not already in one of your local clubs, I highly suggest you get in your club, because not only are the people within these clubs usually really good people, very helpful, nice people where you'll make some really good friends, but it's also an invaluable resource of information on, just events in the area and shows, and for doing stuff like this. When you're doing the conversion, there's always somebody in the club who knows what they're doing and is likely willing to help you out in some way, shape, or form, either with information, parts, or come give you a hand. So oftentimes what happens is you get into something like this, especially if you don't have a whole car, there's extra bits you need that you didn't count on. And you may not even know what those are, and those other club members can absolutely help steer you in the right direction to tell you what bits are missing, what you need, and might even have them sitting in their toolbox or in their parts shelf, whatever. So obviously, if you're going to be doing a twin SU conversion, you at first need to find a pair of twin SUs. So if you don't go and find a whole parts car to get them from, it's recommended to buy them as a full setup like this, preferably with the exhaust manifold as well. And we'll get into that later as to why. This way, you've got the intake manifold, you've got the heat shield, you've got the insulators, you've got all the linkages, and maybe you have all the correct fuel lines, everything you need to make it all work. In this case, this one has some air cleaners that will actually fit on this car, where if you bought a parts car, the standard chrome bumper air cleaners will not fit, and there's not that many good options without spending some decent money on air filters, and I'll show you why here in a second. But he actually got a pretty decent buy on this. This is an HS4 setup, which would be 71 or older. I haven't checked any of the numbers to see exactly what year these are. And it came with some gaskets and stuff, just like it is, already painted manifold. And he got them for a little under $250 with taxes, shipping, and all, which isn't a bad deal. Now, I do believe that these things were already used as a pair of conversion carburetors for a rubber bumper car previously based on looking at this. Because obviously the gulp valve has been plugged off here, but there's no fitting here for the vacuum to the brake reservoir, and that's usually not missing. It's usually a solid plug there if it wasn't used on a conversion. But based on these air cleaners and everything else, and that it was painted black, it was probably already a conversion setup. So now obviously we're missing some bits here. This car is in for a brake booster as well as the dual car conversion. But if you look with the brake booster in place, which I only have part of it here, but it represents good here, you'll notice that this is in line with where the rear carb is going to go, and there's just simply not enough room here for a standard set of air cleaners, so they have to be something really thin. Now, a set of air cleaners like this, they're pretty thin pancake filters. They're not going to be great for performance, but then again, we can't expect a ton of performance out of a rubber bumper car anyway. But they also make, K&N makes a filter that's cone-shaped that will clear the booster. And Moss has a cold air intake kit that also clears the booster. Either way on them, you're spending about $150 on air cleaners. So speaking of performance, what kind of performance gains can you expect by taking the single Stromberg off and putting dual SUs on? Well, you can expect the performance to be pretty close to, say, the 72 to 74 MGBs would be in American spec. So a quick history lesson about US spec cars. When they were introduced in 1962, they had 8.8 to 1 compression and a pair of HS4 carburetors and basically no real emissions equipment at all. Had a PCV valve on it, that was it. And they were rated at 95 horsepower at the flywheel. Now in 1968 they did add an air pump to it, and that's when the air injection stuff started. And they were still rated at 95 horsepower, but there was some parasitic losses due to turning the air pump, but it wasn't really noticeable. Now in 1972, to meet increasing regulations, they dropped the compression down to 8 to 1. And at the same time, they swapped over to a pair of HIF4 carburetors, which we'll get into kind of the difference between those here in a minute. But when they did that, to try to give it a little bit more oomph, especially on the bottom end, they actually changed the cam timing on them. They went from a dual row timing chain to a single row timing chain and advanced the cam a little bit through the way those were machined. So where the early cars would pull to about, I figured it was either 52 or 5,500 before it ran out of cam, the later cars were done by 5,000, 4,800 range. And then they just weren't making any power anymore. They would still rev, but wouldn't make any more power. But also in addition to that, they increased the intake valve size from 1 9/16 to 1 5/8, all in an effort to try to just make it feel a little more sporty, a little more low-end grunt, so as it didn't feel like it had lost that much. Now in 1975, they went to the single Stromberg carburetor. Now this is a 1 3/4 inch single carburetor versus a pair of 1.5 inch carburetors, which means the total airflow available through this carburetor was a lot less. And between that and the crappy exhaust manifold, which we'll get into later, they pretty much just ran out of breath by like 4,500 RPMs. They just couldn't suck in any more air and make any more power after that. They were done. But the way most people drove them, that was fine. And in that time period, 75 through 80, nothing had any power here in America. That was a pretty dark time for performance. And these weren't comparatively all that bad. We look at them as horrible today, but in comparison to everything else on the market, they really weren't terrible. Most enthusiasts will tell you they do not like the HIF4 carburetor, and if you're going to do this swap over, do the HS4s. Now, there are actually benefits to both carburetors and negatives to both carburetors. Here's the HIF4. Now, the difference in nomenclature is the H means it's a horizontal carburetor, and the S means side float bowl, and the 4 meaning it's 4/8 of an inch larger than 1 inch, which means it's 1.5 inches. The HIF is horizontal integrated float bowl. Now, one of the things these things have in them is they have a bimetallic spring on the jet that automatically raises and lowers the jet based on temperature. And most enthusiasts don't like that. Now, in theory, that is better, but 50 years old, they don't always work right, and you can get some variants in idle, but new springs are available if you're willing to put new ones in, which that should fix that problem, right? But one thing you got to remember, these carburetors were always put on 8.8-to-1 motors. These were put on 8-to-1 motors. So the fueling curve of the needles in these carburetors out of the box, set up completely stock, will be a little bit better for these motors than this one will. These will be slightly rich. These will be more on par. So I don't care which one I do. I can work with both of them as equally as well, but a lot of people just stay away from these because they don't understand these and they know these, because this basic setup was used for many, many, many years with the side float bowl. And it is a little bit easier to service. Like if you get some dirt in the needle and seat, you can take the top of the float bowl off, clean it, put new needle and seats in it, whatever you need to do, put it back on without taking the carbs off. These, you're going to take carbs off to work on that. So next, let's talk about cables, because you're going to need both a throttle cable and a choke cable to control these things. And rubber bumper cars from the factory did not have choke cables on them because they were all water choke setups. Now, the HS4s will have this setup right here for the throttle cable to go into, and this holds the end of the throttle cable. Now, the particular one we have here, that's all missing here, and I think I know why, and we'll get into that in a minute. But the HIFs will have a bracket bolted on it right here. And then the throttle cable goes here, and the choke cable goes here. Because the throttle here on the HS4s, that goes down like this. On the HIFs, it pulls up, just the opposite direction. And then the choke cable on the HSs usually were run through this on the back side of the air cleaner. But with these air cleaners, the way these bolt on, they eliminated this. And on this case, they put a little bushing here, which it looks like they just probably ran a screw in there and then drilled it out, and then hooked it up just like a Mini would be hooked up. So with a cable stop right there. So now throttle cable. What throttle cable do you use? Well, that's actually a good question, because on the rubber bumper cars, it's a different throttle pedal. There was a ball on the end of the throttle pedal, or the cable, that goes in there, instead of, well, you can't really see it so well here, this barrel shape. You can still use this, it just won't sit in the pedal quite the same, but you could also in that pedal, you could file that out and make this fit really nicely in there. And this is a cable for like a 62 to 74B. And you can also use a chrome bumper midget cable, because if you notice, the end of it is much more similar here. So you could put this right in there, and you wouldn't have to file it or do nothing. It would just work in the pedal pretty good like it is. Now, the other thing to think about with this setup is the guide in the firewall. It is actually different on a rubber bumper car than it is a chrome bumper car. And you can see the inside of it, they are different. Now, when you look at the parts manual, they show one part number, which will be the early one. Now, the difference is, take the midget cable. Like it would go in here and just stop in the early one. Of course, you take this out normally. Yes, I know. But here is the late one for rubber bumper. So that's one of the things that most people don't think of. You're gonna have to swap out this for an early one to use the early cable. Now, it is also possible to use the original cable from the rubber bumper car, which is probably what we're going to actually be doing on this car, because I think that's how this was set up. That's why that guide is not here. So what you can do is you can just cut this off right here. Yes, you should solder it. And then this would actually just go through there, bolt in, and work out just fine. So that's probably going to be our solution on this particular setup. But most people are going to be using one of the other throttle cable setups. Choke cable. Most people prefer to use the T-knob because it's easier to grab a hold of. Especially if you got a decent return spring here, it's just a lot easier to work with and pull. So most people go with those. But depending on the year of car, you might have to get creative on mounting them. If you got a 1975 or a 1976 car, it's still got the same dash as the 72, 3, and 4 cars. And there's a plug right here for the choke cable. So you can just put the choke cable in there the same way as you would for a 72 to 74 car. So if you got a 77 or later car, obviously there's no place for the choke cable in here. So you got to get a little more creative. Some people will take the rheostat out here and put choke cable right there, which makes some sense because the hole is just about the right size. It'll be nice and solid in there, and nobody ever dims their lights anyway, because you can barely see them when they're bright anyway, unless you've done an LED conversion. So a lot of people just take these out, either let them hang or just connect all the wires together so they're on bright all the time and put it there. Otherwise, you could actually take, like, well, this switch is supposed to be in a steering column, but you could actually put a piece of blank metal here, on one on either side, put it through there, but I found that those can loosen up and move around and not feel very stable. Other people have taken, well, made brackets to go off the bottom of the steering column here and put it underneath there, or you can put it anywhere under here and make any bracket you want. It's up to you to get creative on how you want to do that yourself. So one of the other things that people tend to not think about initially is all the heater hoses, because these have a water choke on it, which means hot water goes through the choke here, and when it's cold, the choke's on, and as it heats up, it turns itself off. Which means you got some extra lines to worry about. You could, though, just cap this, put a cap on it here, and a cap on it here, and still retain this, but it's kind of in the way, and then you gotta figure out how to mount it. The easiest way to do it, if you still got a stock valve cover and you don't mind and you like the look of it, just put the earlier pipe on it here. Then you get the early hose that goes to there, and then it's really easy to go to the parts store and get a heater hose connector. That's 1/2 inch on one side, 5/8 on the other. Put the 5/8 in here and then run a 1/2-inch hose from here to there. And that could be as simple as that. Or you can get really creative and do all kinds of interesting things. People do stainless steel pipe. They do all kinds of stuff. You can also take the early setup that tucks in behind here and do the same thing if you've got like a aluminum valve cover or something. But that there, again, is up to you how you want to handle that. At least part of the reason why they lost so much horsepower on the really late cars is the manifold. Not only was it just a big chunk of iron here that preheated the intake charge by being one piece, which reduced power. Look at what the exhaust path is. It goes there, makes a big old U-turn and comes back. That U-turn, that kills power right there. Now, the early manifold obviously didn't do none of that. Now there is another manifold out there that is kind of a blend of these two. This lower part with this upper part, and it's the Austin Marina manifold. So then you could still run your Stromberg and not have this big restriction here, which will give you some power back, but it's still going to run out of breath at 4,500 RPM because you can't get enough air through the carburetor. Now, it is also possible to cut this off of here and still use this part here with the other intake manifold, but this is such a restriction that you're not really going to see the gains you want to see. So that is the basics of what all you actually need to put a set of twin carbs on a single carb car. It's obviously more than just an exhaust manifold and a set of carbs. And even one of the things I haven't gone over yet was actually like the overflow tubes and stuff. And that comes down to how do you really want to handle that? This one, probably just do a T, take it down over to the charcoal canister, and it'd be pretty similar setup to what the HIF4 carbs were. And if you're doing the HIF4, you could just use the standard piece that goes across that comes up. But there's obviously going to be even more to it than what I've shown you here, detail-wise, because every setup is going to be slightly different. Like we ran into the fact that the choke was set up this way. The arm is not even there. And so it really kind of depends on what he wants to do. If he wants to stick with these air cleaners or go with a different set of air cleaners, it's still going to change the final parts list by a little bit. Now we are looking at going ahead and doing a video on actually installing all this onto the car, and that will be obviously a later video. So basically you could be missing bits or bits of information, and the club members could help you with those missing bits or the bits of information and to know what bits you actually are missing. Something like that.